this is mainly about repatriation, but repatriation is one of those things that really helps people in museums to work differently, to disentangle themselves from the museum space, and to really make it possible to sort of try and make the museum from this, where everything's in storage, to being a much more open and habitable place for people whose connections with museums can often be so troubling. So this is one of our problems. This is the world of the Enlightenment Museum, but it's also the world that continues, particularly through connoisseur kind of scholarship and through the international marketing of other people's things as art and as possessions. So to give you an example of how that relates to Australia, if you were to have the opportunity to purchase from someone a turtle shell mask from the Torres Strait, which was predominantly made before the 1840s, you would be up for $5 or $6 million. The kind of work that goes into connoisseurship is really about marketing and making objects financially more valuable, which is contrary to the ideas, obviously, of the people who created them. It's particularly upsetting when highly spiritual objects, like the Hawaiian figure on the left, are used in sort of this kind of advertising material as brochures and as markers of someone's own personal abilities. So how do you get from connoisseurship to a more collaborative understanding? Exhibitions are always a way to expand broad public knowledge, but also importantly for museums today, and particularly for us lucky enough to live in the Pacific region, there are times when we can really engage in close ways with people whose relationship to the collections are much more ancestral, close, connected to their culture and to their well-being and future lives, because the objects in the museum are not how do we uncover the history in quite the same way as it used to be, but like with James's work, it's about connecting people today with things for their futures, and also with Corinne's work. So we do research in a variety of different ways, but predominantly working with people across the Pacific and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia to understand better what our obligations are. How can we better look after these things if they are to stay with us? Or if they shouldn't stay with us, how can we use the resources of the museum to return to the inheritors of the traditions reflected in the objects that we have? So this is what people generally think of when they think of repatriation. I was very honoured to be in Madang for this repatriation early last year in February, where we returned 16 ancestors from collected in collaboration with Madang peoples in the 1870s by Russian Nikolai Nikolaevich Maklukha, and then returned to them after it had been made, they had been made aware that these ancestors were with our museum. But this is not what often happens in a museum for lots of different reasons, which I won't go into today. But if you want to see more about that, there's an ABC little video that tells you about that. But this was an 8-month journey of preparation, collaboration, taking care to learn how to say things, what to say, translating them into Pidgin, learning how to speak Pidgin better so I could actually talk to people, and working with descendants of these people to ensure that the ways that they were brought back was in keeping with how they should be brought back. How should they be returned to their communities? How can that progress? But this is another kind of repatriation that was, so if that repatriation cost upwards of $70,000, which came from the museum's budget, this repatriation cost the museum the work of 2 museum and heritage studies student internships, my time, and the great support of the trustees of the National Museum and Art Gallery of Papua New Guinea. So their costs were the greatest costs of shipping. Our costs were very minimal. But this repatriation returned Mr. Kaleni, who's here on the right with his portrait, his collection of around 460 objects that he had collected when he lived in Papua New Guinea between 1967 and 1976. So he brought them back with him to Australia. He became part of the sort of local connoisseurship world, talking with people in the Oceanic Art Society about the things, about their time. These are really about the memories that they shared together of a different time in Papua New Guinea's life. And he's there with the minister who came to formally receive the collection before it departed. As you can expect, it took a lot of time. Mr. Kaleni was 93. He lived on his own. His apartment was not great, sanitary-wise and in terms of everything. It was a difficult space. A lovely man who truly treasured and really admired the things that he had acquired and really admired the people who had made them. At first he wanted all of his collection to go to a museum. No Australian museum would take it, in part because they are of this liminal period before the connoisseurship, and before art came to be. So it's at this moment that was most important for the National Museum of Papua New Guinea, because it represented a time that was not collected of their cultural history, because it was the present and people were not collecting it for the museum. So by his collecting this, it gave the museum a group of materials that they could exhibit and talk with people about, whose memories were still there. This was people's grandparents' generations, people's parents' generations, and it has subsequently been used in the refurbishment of one of their gallery spaces. But it is a difficult kind of undertaking for them, because just like the weeks and weeks of work of preparing lists, tidying, cleaning, tagging, photographing, all of those things that go along with an inventory that you need to make, that also has to be replicated at the National Museum, which was severely underfunded at the time. This is about, when did it happen? 2010. At the time, the National Museum was being threatened with constant closure. There were money problems. The trustees were trying to put it back on a good footing. There was support from the Australian government. And so this repatriation was also a political event. It was about showing that the National Museum could take in and was a place that should be seen to be a repository for international collections like this. And then a very fortunate circumstance in terms of how do you connect with people. So that repatriation, we collaborated with the trustees of the National Museum principally. It was not our job to do a lot of the work of where did they come from, who did they come from. That is the work of the National Museum. It was our job to get it to them. At this point, I was working for the exhibition Title Kin, and one of the stories we were featured in the end only in song was from Tuvalu, who were great pioneers of Pacific European voyaging, if you like. So people, if you look at shipping lists from the 19th century, there are Tuvalu people everywhere on these boats. They are always traveling. They were coming in and out. They were boat hands. They'd looked at ways that they could continue their own lives and great maritime traditions in different ways, I guess. This is from the expedition of Griffith Taylor. Again, another link to James's talk, as he was invested in coral dating and understanding coral reef systems. But in talking with one of the descendants of these photographs for the exhibition, she said, I can't believe I've never seen these. This is my family. This is our family. This is us. And so Catherine Edgeworth-David took a lot of these kinds of photographs of people lining up to be taken photographs of, or people sort of just sitting around, and they named people. So you had both the family resemblances that people often see in these kinds of photographs, but also the ability to use those slim references and the time periods to really make sure that they knew who everybody was. We sent all of these photographs to the National Archives, and then we formally made it a UNESCO Memory of the World Pacific project. And so now this group of photographs, the work of it with David in the reef systems, is recognised on the International Register. It's often called repatriation. It is really just sharing. It is a digital sharing. So while those people have in Tuvalu have access to all the images, high quality images, they've been digitised, the negatives sit with us and with the Australian Museum and other places. And we haven't been asked for further material. So this is where they are at the moment in terms of what they want. And then 2 minutes, this is my last slide. And then at the end of Tidal Kin, there had been a bit of unhappiness about how we had approached the Tahitian story. We had gone to loan something from the Powerhouse Museum. We got authority from a Raitan descendant called Pauline Reynolds, who was also a Pitcairn Island descendant and who'd done a lot of work in bark cloth. But the National Museum were not happy that I had not personally talked to them as well. And so that was something that I should have done. No questions asked. But at the same time, it offered an opportunity to talk with the director of the Tahitian Museum about something that had just come up on a phone call. A long University of Sydney graduate who's been interested in the Nicholson Museum particularly is very interested in connoisseurship and having was a descendant of the Henry family, who were pioneer missionaries to Tahiti. And in his possession and in the possession of the Ryde church, its name I've gone out of my head now, but anyway, a church in Ryde that he was associated with, were diaries, a King James Bible version with this script, but also the first Tahitian version of the Bible, and other kinds of materials like a 1888 journal of one of the Williams descendants going and visiting Tahiti. So it wasn't ours as a museum, it was the church in Ryde and this individual donator, but we're able to use museum systems to connect us up, to work out a way that would mean that we could get all of this to Tahiti with neither the Tahitian Museum nor ourselves having any financial underlay, which happened remarkably, and these are all now in Tahiti. Very lastly, Grant McCall, another University of Sydney anthropologist who passed away recently, spent 60 years of his life going back and forwards to Rapa Nui and working with people there about their things. And he collected a lot of things at that time. He had a great interest in the tourism fascination of the ancestors and an enormous collection of them, from everything from a soft toy to, you know, a beer holder, really awful ways that you would conceptualize these ancestors and what they mean. But a lot of them were also carved by expert carvers at the time, whose main income was through tourism. In this collection was a tooth that a tourist had taken from underneath one of the ancestors in Rapa Nui. And she wrote to Grant and said, oh, look, I don't know why I did it, but can you get this tooth back for me? So she'd done this in the 70s and she sent it off to him in the 80s. He passed away without being able to sort of tidy up this. So with his family and with Carlos, who's a PhD student in anthropology at the museum, at the university, I can't remember his last name, connected up with the family of elders in Rapa Nui about what we should do. And subsequently, it all folded out that at the end of the day, the tooth was able to be found thanks to Hong Kong intern students who were working with me to document the collection. And a ceremony was able to happen at the Gadigal Centre for that tooth before the elders took it home again. So that's me. It's really about what's possible without money, without funding. We often don't have time to do very complicated grants, but it is just being able to be connected with people, to continue to try and make sure people understand that museums today, our museum at least is not interested in the keeping, but the sharing and the working with, that we can continue to do this kind of work.
Round of applause for Dr. Jude Philp. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And sorry, everyone, we're just gone over time, but I just wanted to make a quick comment, Jude. Just again, love that presentation. Again, it's about this idea of connecting culture and history with community in a helpful way. Really, as you said, decolonial approaches to ensuring that institutions of this nature are doing that. I think Amanda has a quick question potentially. I know we've got over time, but I'm happy, Amanda, if you wanted to ask a question.
I'm sure I could talk to Jude later if we're out of time, but it's so great, Jude, to see all those examples alongside one another. And it's maybe not a quick thing to answer, but I was just wondering about the differences between returning things to a museum, an institution, or returning ancestors to a precise community, and how you make those, how those decisions come about. You mentioned that with the Tahitian example, that, you may have connected with people directly, but then the institutions are upset that they weren't, how do you sort of navigate those in the whatever 1 minute you have to talk about that?
You all, I think we all know that the Pacific is a joyous place to work, but also politically very complex and really difficult, particularly when you're dealing with distance. If you don't have the money to travel initially and to do all of that careful work that, Corinne's project shows really how it should be, everything should be done with such care and planning moving forward. But museums are volatile places where your time is not your own. So it's really about listening as much as we can. We did not have the approval of the National Museum to return the Madang ancestors, but that's partly because for 7 months they never responded. They didn't respond to DFAT, they didn't respond to us, and partly that was probably because of my association with the trustees, which had helped the colonial material get back, and who had subsequently been dispelled from the museum. The museum no longer has trustees. So there are always going to be political issues, and I don't think that we will ever successfully do things. That only with listening to people can you avoid mistakes like returning something to the wrong person entirely. And I think that's the really, really problematic situation. So as long as the community is connected, I feel that that's the major job. If the institution has ruffled feathers at some point or other, just like ours does at sometimes, it's a small problem.